How's it going, everyone?
Evening.
Pretty good.
How are you guys doing tonight?
Not too bad. Just working on homework.
Yeah, almost recovered from this damn flu I've had for 2 weeks.
It's not good.
Well, it's 80 degrees out today.
Yeah, it was pretty warm today too. It was 60, 70 here. So
Same. Can you guys hear me?
yep.
Cool. Hey, I think I already have a question if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it, man.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and screen share. Oh, never mind. So
I
on
could I
the
could set it up for you real quick.
okay.
All right. Should be able to share now.
Awesome, thank you. So on the homework, it's asking us to make these fields in card with like value and name. Is it asking us to like write out the int values for the cards and like type in ace of diamond, ace of spades, and all that, or what does it mean by that?
Yeah, well, you want to do the suits and whatnot.
Oh, so the name would be just the suits.
Yeah, yeah. So like you want to be able to combine the name, the suits, and the value. Um, Tonight,
Okay.
what we're doing here is we're doing JPA. It's a little bit more into Spring Boot. I know that they have back end office hours tomorrow and Wednesday, and I believe Thursday as well. Maybe
Uh,
Friday too. But this is like for Spring Boot, and
oh, gotcha.
furthermore, if you want to stick around, that's fine. But
Okay.
yeah, yeah, for the name though, you just want to make sure that you have the suits and be able to later on combine the value with the name of the card with the value, right?
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep, not a problem. How have you been, Jacob?
Well, I got a an email from the company that gave me that hacker level test,
Yeah.
um, and it wasn't a thanks. We've decided to move on email. So apparently, I'm still in the interviewing process.
Heck yeah, man.
Um, the the main problem was here's uh here's some criteria. Go write an API, and there was no way I could write a full API in 2 hours. Um, I'm just not that up on it yet, but um, I was able to stub it out and get it started, and making some JPA calls in the process. So
Heck yeah. Well,
um,
I know once you get more comfortable with JPA, I suggest like practicing it and creating your own projects with it. Um, you should be able to create simple API within a couple hours, I think. I know I've done it in the past where, just keep practicing, you'll eventually get to a point where you feel pretty confident with it.
yeah. I mean that's literally was the factors. I just don't have enough practice under my belt yet.
Yeah. Well, now this week we're going to do something pretty interesting. This is a little bit more complicated than what we have been learning. I don't know how familiar you guys are with DTOs. They're called data transfer objects, and basically the whole premise of them is to basically create a layer between your entities and kind of your controller and your service layer, right? Sometimes you don't want to make it so apparent, like if you have the user and then the password, you don't want to have a get call and get the password, right? You don't want everybody to see, even if it's hash and whatnot. So this is just kind of a separation of stuff, and it makes everything a little bit more. You have a lot more code with it, so tonight might be a little bit longer. But in the real world, you'll probably be using DTOs, so I think it's important to talk about them a little bit. So I would suggest, if you guys are coding along, make sure to launch your Spring Tool suite. And I'll fire mine up real quick too. All right, I'm going to begin by sharing my Spring Tool suite. Can you see this all right?
Yep.
Okay. Made some changes, basically to the, I was recording in 720p, so I wanted to record in 1080p, but my screen is pretty big, so I want to make sure that everybody could see it real quick. Okay, so very first thing that we want to do is go into this main, and we want to create a package, and we'll just name it DTO. And when we're creating DTOs, the way I'm going to do it, you have to make sure that you have at least Java 14. If you don't have Java 14, well, I'm using Java 17, for example, we won't be able to use records. We can still use classes, but the way I'm teaching it tonight, we'll be using records. So we'll create a new record, and we will call this user DTO. And right here, inside these brackets right here, we'll list our record. So we want to make sure that we get the ID or the private key of the user. Also, we want to use the name, and we want to return also a string of role and a string of email. So how we'll do that is we'll just say long ID, and we'll do string name for the username. And for the role, do this, and the same thing for the email. Need to import list, Java util, and there's our user DTO. Now we can create DTOs for our email and role too, which we'll do that as well. Same thing, we'll create more records, and we'll do email DTO. Same thing as before, but we want to return the email address. But this is going to be a little bit simpler. We're just going to have these two right here. And then we'll create another record called role DTO. very similar to the email. Now we need to get into our repositories. I want to make one update to our user repository. Instead of using optional, we're just going to get rid of optional. And you'll find out a little bit later. Delete this import. Now we also need to create new interface. We'll do the email repository, which is very much similar to all this, to the user repository, except we're not going to have that custom method that we did last week. Make sure to annotate it as repository. We want to extend the JPA repository. Make sure we put our email in there and the type of our private key, which is long. All right. Now we move on, create a new interface for the role repository. Same thing as before. All right. So now there's a few different ways of doing DTOs. We will just put everything in a service layer, but a lot of people like to put mappers to this, but instead we'll map using the service layer. And we'll just go into our user service. And we'll change a lot of the stuff around compared to last week. So what we want to do is, instead of using user right here for our save user, we want to put user DTO, call it user DTO, import it, and show you a little bit of a trick. We're going to actually call an ID, but we'll be calling the role ID, and we'll call this role ID. You'll see why this is important later on. To get users, it's going to be pretty much the same, but we're going to be switching user around with the user DTO. Anytime you do a GET request, you're going to want to make sure that you return this DTO. And same thing right here. We're going to want to change this to user DTO, but we also want to do this as a list. And this ID will say user ID, because we're getting the user by the user ID. With the update user, do the same thing here. Call user ID, but we'll be doing the user DTO here. And we'll also want to refer back to the role ID. So we'll put in another long role ID. And with the delete user, it doesn't really matter, but I want to show you guys different ways of using the DTO. We can keep it the way it is, but tonight this is all about DTOs, so we will just put in user DTO, user DTO. And down here, we want to use user DTO, but we want to make this just a list. With the DTOs, you don't really need the optional in there too, so that's kind of nice. That's pretty much it for the service layer for users, or the user service. Now we'll get into the implementation. Any questions about this so far? Okay. Now we'll get into the user service implementation. One thing that I want to do here is we want to put in the role repository because we will be calling on that. Okay. And we want to make sure that our dependency injection is accurate. So we'll update that as well. And here with save user, we're going to do user DTO. Better import this here as well. And I'll just go through. The biggest thing when we're doing DTOs is we want to do it mostly for the get, but we can also call on our DTOs to create a user object as well. So we're going to be returning a user, but we're going to use the DTO in our interfaces and whatnot. The save user ultimately becomes a lot more complicated. So let's try this out. We're going to want to create a new user called new user. And we want to call a role called existing role. And we want to call on the role repository, find by ID. Oh, I forgot one thing up here. We want to make sure that this long role ID. This is why we're including the role ID here. And I will just copy all this from before because it's basically the same thing, same type of exception, although we will do a little bit different. We'll call this role instead of user, and we'll call the role ID. Need to import the role, make sure that you have the right one. Okay. So existing role. Oh. And we want to set the role ID, which is role ID. And we want to call a new user. And we want to set the username with, we will go call user DTO dot name. I'll separate this a little bit so it's easier to see. Now, when we're converting it like this, we can't directly just add the existing role to new user. What we're going to do is, since the user, we'll go to the model real quick. Since the user calls on role, and this is the many-to-many relationship, we're going to make it a set. It's the only way the only way we can actually do this correctly for the saving part. When we're getting it, we can cast it to the list, but we're kind of going in reverse here to start it off. So we want to create a set of role, and we will just call this set existing role. And we will make a new hash set. We have to import set and hash set. And then we're going to call on the existing role and add it to this new hash set. So that existing role dot add existing role. Now we get the new user. And we will set the role. You see how this is asked to be a set of role, right? And we will set the existing role. And then we will just return new user. I know that's quite a bit more than what we did before. Are there any questions about this? No, there's a little bit going on here.
Just as long as you put up the video.
This is a lot more complicated than last week, or the week before that too. I'll just run through it, the whole idea about this. So we're returning a user entity. We're going to be calling on our DTO and our API requests. And so we want to make sure that when we do that, we're creating an object of new user. And then we also want to make sure that the role is there that we're calling on. With that existing role, we do that. And then we make sure that the role ID is what we're calling here. And our new user, we want to set that name to the user DTO of name. We can go back up here. That's what I'm talking about right there. When we're returning it back, we need to make sure it's a set of role. That's what we're calling set existing role. And to add our existing role to that, we need to make sure that we do this keyword right here. And this is how we're returning the new user. I know it's a lot going on there. So I would play around with that going forward, trying to break things and fix them. But this is just kind of the gist of what you want to try and do when you're saving, updating, that sort of thing. When you're saving it, you want to use the DTO to save it as a user. So the DTO is kind of in the middle. But when you're getting it, you want to get the DTO. You don't want to get the user. And I'll show you the get all users now. It's quite a bit different than this, but I think that this is a little bit easier to understand because right now we're going to actually be going into functional programming. With this one, we want to return a user DTO. So how do we go about doing that? We're going to have to stream it, then map it. What we're going to map is the user. We use a lambda to our new user DTO. From here, we want to call on user dot user ID, comma, user dot get username, comma, user dot get role. And we're going to have to stream the role as well, since it is a list. I'm going to do very similar things as above. Oh, I didn't period there, so we're going to have to map it. And we're going to map role and get role name. Then we want to collect it. We call collectors dot to list, comma. From here, we got to get our email. So we would do user dot get email. And we will do something very similar to right here. I'll copy this. Just indent this. But we don't want to call on role. We want to call on email. And I haven't updated the email yet. So, but what we're going to have to call is the email address. I want to collect. Same thing as above. Collectors to the list. I think I got too many there. Let's check this out. We're gonna have to import our email, make sure it's the right one. And there we go. That's all of it. We're going to copy a lot of this going forward with our GET requests, but this is what you want to do for mapping. This is kind of a general thing for functional programming and mapping for DTOs. Like I said, I thought that this was a little bit easier up here with the save user than getting it. It's a little bit easier to wrap your mind around. I don't know how much knowledge you all have with just generally doing functional programming. We do a little bit of lambdas in the coursework, but not too much. Okay, we'll do something extremely similar in this next one. So the difference is we're just getting it by ID instead of getting all of it. And another thing is we don't really want to return this exception here because we're returning a list. So we'll actually return this again, but we won't put in our exception. And a good way of doing this is actually creating a new object called existing user. All right, So now, create a space, return user repository dot find my ID. And we will do very much everything that we did up above. So we will just copy and paste this. And it's fine to get this warning here. We're not really using existing user, but when we get into the controller, you want to check that that user actually exists and throw an exception if it doesn't. But we won't be using it anywhere else in the code. And I will actually go to this one down below, since we're on the topic of Git. I'll come back up to update here in a second. But very much the same thing. What we want to do is just copy paste what's up above. Make sure that we have everything saved. We have the repository saved. And, oh, that's the reason we want to make sure that this is a DTO. Okay, so we have all of our GET requests out of the way for user. Now we can do the update and delete user. So right here, we're going to do DTO, DTO, and we actually are going to have two IDs, so we want to make sure that we have this separated. Okay. And we're actually going to be calling both user ID and role ID in these exceptions. I'll just copy what I have up here. The existing role. So this is a little bit different. It's kind of the same pattern as what we were doing before, but we want to set the username. Instead of calling user, we'll call, get rid of all this right here. User DTO dot name. Now we also want to call the existing role. Dot set role ID. And we'll get the role ID. And a lot of this is same up as up above when we're doing our this stuff right here. It's pretty much the same thing. So we'll go and copy this. And that's it. We don't need to change any of this other stuff. Right here, we want to make sure that the user is there and the role is there when we're updating. And if it's not there, then it's going to throw an exception for one or the other. And all this is very similar to what we did when we created the user. Like I said, with the delete user, we could probably keep what we have, but I want to show you how we're going to do it with the DTO. It's not really that necessary though. So just bear in mind, you don't need to do this. This is just showing how to do it. And what we're going to do here, instead of calling the ID, since we got rid of that, we're going to do DTO dot ID. And we'll change this to the same. We want to make sure that we set the ID to our DTO ID. And we'll copy in the same thing right here. And we want to delete by ID. Copy this again. Just put that in there. Okay. This is one thing that might get a little confusing. You can't get the user ID right here. You want to set it. So if you ever have that error where the get is getting angry at you, just make sure that you have set instead of get. And I know this can be confusing. When you're saving something, you want to set it. When you're getting something, obviously you want to get it, right? All right, so now we have everything done for user service and user service implementation. Now we can go on to creating a new interface, and we will call this our email service. In this interface, we will create our methods, public, email, save email. And we'll call our email DTO. And we will call on actually a long of user ID. Since email is a one-to-many, many-to-one mapping with the user ID is stored in the email. So we want to be able to call on that ID, make sure that that user is actually there, much like what we did in the user service. And we're not going to get too crazy with all this other stuff. We just want to do a save, and we want to do a get. Now we create a new service implementation, which is a class, email service IMPL. And we want to make sure that our interface is our email service. Okay. All right. We want to make sure that this is annotated as @service. And we're going to get the email repository. And we will get the user repository. Not necessary to write out user repository or email repository. You can do eRepo or uRepo, user repo, something like that. But just so it's easier for you guys to understand, I'm going to write out everything. Now we want to do our dependency injection. on both repositories. The constructor. And there we go. So a lot of what we're doing here is extremely similar to how we did stuff with the user. So what we can do, we can copy some of this, but it's going to be a lot different. But just know that this is going to be very much the same. All right, so we're going to create email, new email. And we want to vary user as well, which would be the existing user. We want to find by ID. We will call the user ID. Or else throw no, we don't want to find all by ID. We just want to find by ID. Okay, lambda. A new resource not found exception. And we want to make sure that what we're doing is we're calling on our user with the ID. Want to make sure that the exception throws user ID if it's not found. Import the user. Now we want to set the ID for the existing user. And the email, I want to set the email address. And we will do email.dto.address. And we will set the new user, or set the email user, I should say. And we will return email repository dot save new email. Okay. Get all emails. This is a little bit smaller than what we had to do for the users because there is less in the email DTO than there is in the user DTO, but it's still very much the same principle. We want to return the email repository, find all, stream, map, email, DTO. Make sure that we put in new. Get the email ID. And we want to make sure first that we put a comma there and want to get the email address. That's it for the email DTO, or email service, I should say. The role service is going to be very similar to us. There's not too much else going on. The user service is definitely going to be the toughest. And once you understand what's going on with all this stuff here, like I said, I hope that you guys look at this stuff, play around with it, create your own, and get familiar with this. There's different ways of doing this mapping too. Like I said, you can use mappers, you can use plugins like MapStruct or Map Model. Those are two things that can help you with the mapping if you're unsure about things. But this is how you do it on your own. And I figured it'd be the good place to start out. So we want to create a new interface. This is for our role. So we will call this role service. Basically the same stuff that we did in our email service. Not too crazy stuff right here, but we're just going to be calling the role. Put a semicolon there. We need to give this a name. All right. Create a new class. Role service IMPL. Interface is our role service. And this one, we're just gonna make sure that our dependency injection is just our role repository. We're not gonna use another repository in here. We have to make sure that we call it a service. Now for our dependency injection, Here we're going to set the role name. We'll call the role. And then just return repository dot save new role. A lot simpler. For this, also, it's a lot simpler than what we've done. So all we're going to do is return repository, find all, stream and map it. Here we're going to call on the role, lambda, new role DTO. Role ID, comma, role name, select it, and send it to a list. All right, now our services are all ready to go. Do we have any questions up to this point? Next, we'll get into the controllers. And this actually might be a little bit shorter than what I was expecting it to be. I know a lot of this stuff is a little bit different than probably what you've done before. We're still doing stuff with JPA, but we're trying to use the DTOs in a JPA way. Some people might have done DTOs with JDBC, and DTOs aren't necessarily a JPA specific thing that you can do, but they're always a good practice. All right. And our user service, well, this is going to be pretty much the same, but we're just going to change out a few things here and there. With our post mapping, our very first one, we're still going to return a user, but our request body is going to be user DTO. DTO. We will have to import that. And we're going to request a param. That will be the role ID. Then when we save this, we want to just pass along DTO, our role ID. So our first get mapping, we're going to return user DTO. And this is pretty much the same. There's nothing crazy going on here. We're just changing out the DTO with user. And with the ID is a little bit different, but still very similar. We're going to want to change all that around. And let's see. is it throwing us this? Did we make an error with our? Okay, we'll go back to the service. We'll get the user by ID. What's it saying here? The user by ID to user DTO. Looks like it is user DTO. Ah, that's probably why right there. I didn't have that. Let's check it out. Okay, yeah, that was my bad. I made it a list. So what we'll have to do here is change the return type in the controller. And we will just say list right here. Do the same thing down below. There we go. With our put mapping, I want to change this around a little bit. With our path variable, I want to call this user ID. And I want to request param. We'll call this role ID. That's a big long. ID. Okay. And all we're going to be doing here is changing this to user ID and adding in a role ID. Oh, we need to make sure that this is user DTO. This is why when you do some of the stuff, you want to make sure you get your DTOs in first. It's always going to be a pain in the butt going back and changing it. Going to be little things that you did. They're a little bit different. All right. So we're not going to be calling it by the ID. Like I said, you can do that. That's totally fine. You can get away with that. You don't need to do with the delete user. You don't need to call in a DTO, but I'll just show you what it would kind of look like. It's not really important to do this. And let's do request body. And we will call the user DTO, user DTO. User DTO there and there. Like I said, you don't need to do that. You can do it just fine the way before. And here we will have to get rid of optional down here as well. And we're gonna have to change this to user DTO. And that's it. So we have two more controllers left to do, our email controller and our role controller, and then we can test this out. So we want to create a new class. We will call this email controller. And honestly, what I'm going to do here is to save a little bit of time. We're just going to copy all this right here. And then we're going to refactor all this stuff here. We want to make sure we do this. We call it a REST controller, and we want to make sure that this mapping is to email. But here, we want to call on our email service. And we're going to call this email controller or dependency injection. Switch this around. Make sure we change the method name. Make sure we change the DTO that we're calling. This is going to be calling the user ID. Okay. Same thing here. Let's switch all this around. All emails. That's it. Now let's just take out all the user stuff. And we'll create a new controller. New class. This is our role controller. And I will copy and paste what we did before. Go to email. Make sure to change our mapping. Role. I'm going to call on the role service. One thing that we will do that's a little different is we'll get out this parent since we're not calling on that like we were with the other two. There we go. Open this up a little bit. And there's one more thing that I want to do as we're getting further into this program is go to the application.properties. I want to change line 6. We can change this to update from now on. All right, let's run this and see if everything runs correctly. Well, started up okay. Let me change my screen here to Mozilla. Can you see Mozilla all right?
Yep.
Okay. So we'll go to Swagger. As you can see, we have our user controller, our role controller, and our email controller. One thing that we want to start out doing is we want to create our role. So we'll go in here. As you can see, it's using ID and role. This is the DTO. So let's try it out. Technically, it's going to automatically do the ID, so we don't need to do that. We'll create a couple roles. We'll call one user and see role ID 1, role name user. And we will do the next one. We'll call it admin. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have both those in there. So this is what our DTO is showing us, the ID with the role user and ID2 with the role admin. You can tell a little bit of difference. This is the DTO response body right here. Okay. This response body is the entity response body. So if you can tell a little bit of difference about how it's saying role ID and role name versus we have ID and role. Next, we want to post some users and we want to associate that with the role ID. So we'll do 1 and all we need to do here, we'll say Tom. And it's going to start. And number 2, do Debbie. John. Sam. And we'll create one admin. We'll say Mary. Now, how do we know that that actually did that? We'll try and do a get. And our first one, obviously we don't have anything in there. We can update this here in a little bit actually. But Tom is a user, Debbie, John, Sam are users, and Mary is an admin. Another thing I want to do is go to the email now. And we'll just do Mary. And what is her ID again? I think it's 6. Okay. So we'll do our user ID of 6. And we'll say Mary at email.com. And we can give her a couple more emails too. We can say business So she has 2 emails. Now we can check this out. I can get back here. We'll get all the users. Actually, we'll go by ID because we want to check out what Mary has. As you can see, she has 2 emails, the business email and the regular email. Now I want to update user 1, and we'll call user, we'll give him an admin, okay? And we'll just say, I don't know if we have a Mark, we'll do Mark. And it doesn't matter what we do for the role right here because we're already calling on the ID. Now let's check that he does have an admin role. So he is user ID 1. Check it out. And no, he does not have a role. So I have to make sure that I set it right. Let's do that. Nope, role's not coming up. Okay, this is why we always want to test things typically. But go back into our Eclipse or Spring Tool suite. Just do a double check here. Hmm. Let's try doing it like that real quick. I have to do things a little bit differently, but we'll try that at first. Okay, I'm gonna get a new one. Make sure that we have all our users real quick. Yep, Mark one. I'd have to try something a little bit different. Get this working. Yep. All right. Let's do it like this. Don't think this is going to work, but we can check it out. Another way we can do this is we can actually put the update into the role itself up here. I think that might be something that we can think about. Okay. Well, for now, let's actually just show that the delete is working. And I'm just doing ID number 1. I know it might say all this stuff right here. Doesn't matter. All that's important is the ID. And we can actually check out. There's no ID 1 now. All right, let's try and work on the update user again. All right, let's try it this way. And let's remove this. I'll create a new user. We'll give them the ID 1, and we'll just call it string. So user ID 7. Let's try this out. 7, 2. Try it, Mark. Okay. Now let's see. There we go. So Mark has the role of user. I think that's what we had before. Let's check. We did put 2. All right. Well, this is the gist of it. I'll have to play around, see if I can figure out why this isn't working quite right. I know when I was testing, I was getting the whole ID and the name in there as well for the DTO. So we can try it like this. It's always something that doesn't want to cooperate with you sometimes. So we'll go back to Mark. Try and make him an admin. Yep. Hmm. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? Oh, that way. A little bit of a hiccup here, but that's not what I was trying to do there. Okay, so another thing that we can try and do is actually put in the role DTO up here as well. This might make a little bit more sense to do it that way. And mind you, this is just a simple workaround for tonight. There's a lot better ways of doing this. Okay. Back to Swagger. First off, we'll get Mark. He's a user. So let's see if we can change him to an admin. Let's try that out. Nope, doesn't like that request. All right, let's take that out. Still getting a bad request. Yeah, it doesn't like that. Oh, it's no worries, Chris. I know, right now, I had things set up a little bit differently with how I did this initially when I was thinking this all out. I figured an easy way of doing this was just making it go by the ID. Apparently, I have something a little bit messed up here. We can go back.
So why is there two IDs?
So you're getting your role ID and your user ID. I'll actually delete this because that did not help.
But shouldn't user ID be very varchar?
What?
Because role ID would be a number. I would assume user ID would be a varchar, right? Like a name.
No, they're both longs. I just whenever I set this up, I was trying to just call on the ID itself. Let me take a quick look at my notes here. I know with like what Dr. Rob likes to do, he has the IDs as varchars. For me, how I was doing it was the IDs are the private keys. They'd be like the .pk, the .fk, right? Because right here, you see, we're trying to get find by the user ID and the role ID because these are both many-to-many mappings. So we want to make sure that there's both a user with that ID and also a role with that ID. And I'm going to set the username like so. Set the role like so. Mm. Ah, I see. So silly. We want to make sure that we're adding the existing user, or the role to the existing user. Okay. Set role. There we go. So something so silly like that. Okay. All right. Now, no. bring up Zoom here. Go back to Swagger. Thank you guys for bearing with me. So let's check out Mark again. He's a user. And this should work. We'll do 7, 2. We'll make Mark. We'll say Marcus this time. So Mark is now Marcus. And let's, on the roll, let's go to a string. Oh boy. Let's check out what roll is doing now.
So today we just added roles, right?
Yep. Oh, okay. So what ended up happening was here. We will call this admin now. Response empty is saying it's admin, overthrowing a string. What is that? We're making progress anyways. Probably because I'm not setting the name.
Hey Kyle.
Yep.
So our user service MPL, the one you're on right now, these are all interfaces, right?
This, the MPL is a class. You have to annotate it as service.
Okay.
Okay. Let's try and get them back to a user. Saying string, string. There we go. Right on. Now let's change him to an admin. Go back to Mark. Oh yeah, we have to, since we already changed the role somehow, need to go in and actually post admin. Oh, we don't want email. So call this admin, execute. This is 3. So let's go up here, change this to 3. And then let's get Mark. There you go. He's an admin now. Oh, don't you just love stuff like that? But when you're playing around with this stuff, there's always going to be certain errors. And like with DTOs, this is why some people use mapping and whatnot. I had thought that I had got it all ready to go. one thing that I didn't have correct, I had actually two things incorrect, was line 104, I didn't get the role name once I set it, and line 108, I didn't set the role for the existing user as the set existing role. So it's a couple things that I should have done. I just spaced it out. And like I said, it can only be a couple things and it'll throw off your whole code. So you want to make sure that when you do stuff like this, that, you know, you might want to use something like map struct when you're first starting out. And, you know, this is one thing why unit tests might help too. But it didn't take us too long to figure out this error. I'd say what, like 15 minutes or so, going back and forth. And sometimes you have to do that to make sure everything's working right. Next week, well, I think I want to try and get into like Spring Security and stuff with you guys, but figured that this is a decent topic with DTOs. It's a lot to cover. I know that this night ran a little bit longer than nights before, but you know, this is something that you might experience when you guys get a job in the back end. I know a lot of companies will actually do this and use the DTO method because sometimes your databases will change, but some of the calls on that, you don't want to break the front end. When you change your database and you're only using entities, you can actually break the whole front end. So using DTOs can be a way of making sure that you don't break anything further downstream. And it can also have a lot of helps with calling many things. You can actually call a lot more than just what we did. I just kind of wanted to show mapping in general, but potentially you really don't need an email DTO or a role DTO. You can just have a user DTO and it covers everything, right? And that's just the gist of why you want to use DTOs. There's quite a few benefits for using them. There's a lot of ways to do them incorrectly, and it's definitely a lot more work. So when you do create a project and you want to use DTOs, I would suggest try to implement them right off the bat. And another thing is this record right here that we're using, it's only applicable to Java 14 and above. So if you're using something like Java 11 or Java 8, you won't be able to use record. Are there any questions before we finish up?
Kyle, is there ever a situation where you wouldn't want to use DTOs?
When you're doing a demo, you don't want to use DTOs. When that's the very first thing you don't want. When you're doing a demo, you don't need the DTOs. And there's certain cases where if you know your database is not going to change at all, you don't need to use a DTO. If you have sensitive information in your database, you would want to use a DTO though, just to protect that sensitive information. Like obviously, like if we used user and password, right? We wouldn't want to be calling on the password itself. There's going to be situations where you can also use many different DTOs. Tonight, I was very simple, just kind of use the user DTO as the main one, but also use role and email as well. But let's say that we had something like a password here that we created. And well, we have a save user, but we can't save with the password now, right? So we would need to change that around quite a bit. And we wouldn't want to necessarily have the response body be the user, right? We'd probably want the response body to be the DTO instead. That way, we're not responding with what we put in our password and we're responding to the web page as, oh, this is our password that we put in, right? So you can get a lot more complicated in this stuff. This is just the bare basics. And I know there are a lot of companies out there, they'll use DTOs for some of the reasons that I described, some that I haven't described. But basically, when you don't want to use it, you don't have any sensitive information in it that you like a password or something, or that sort of thing. You wouldn't want to use you, you would want to use a DTO if you're doing passwords. But if there's nothing that's really that sensitive, it's fine. Also, if you're just doing it as a demo, then don't deal with the DTOs, just do the entities. And if you want to just prove that you know this, the entities are just fine. The DTOs, chances are they'll have something in place already at a company. You won't be like building all the stuff from the ground up a lot of times. So that's the main gist of it. DTOs originally were created as a way to reduce the cost of remote transactions, right? So back the 90s, early 2000s, when you're connecting remotely, you'd have to connect into a database. The internet speed wasn't as great. So a lot of this was made so that you would combine the user, the role, and the email, and who knows whatever into one call, right? Instead of having to do many different calls. So that's another use for DTOs and what they're originally developed for, but they've kind of evolved over time.
Very cool.
And it's definitely a little bit more complicated than just doing the entity route, but it's kind of a separation of the database from your service and business logic itself. So there's quite a few different reasons to use DTOs. I'd suggest looking into them if you're interested. But right here, this is basically, you could do everything for the project for Promeneo. Obviously, this is a little bit overkill with the DTOs, but I wanted to do it this way instead of showing it how to do everything with all the services the other way, because this is a little bit added complexity, and it's definitely something that's it gets you thinking a little bit more. I think with JPA sometimes you kind of do the same things over and over again, where doing stuff with the DTOs, you really have to think about all this other stuff like streaming and mapping and making sure that these data types can coexist together, translating things from lists to sets and sets to lists. Like that can be kind of a pain in the butt. So this is all I have for tonight. Is there any more questions, or you guys think you got it?
Thank you.
Not a problem.
The videos, but I mean, the DTOs are all just regular classes, right? For the most part.
DTOs are what you can use classes. What I'm using is what's called a record. So I mean, you can see in here, they're just very small. There's nothing crazy going on with this DTO itself. It's the serialization and deserialization of the DTO, the entity, which is kind of complicated. And how I've done it tonight, I did it into the service. A lot of people will create a mapper class, right? But I just put it into the service itself. But you can also create a mapper class. And like I said, I suggest to you guys to go online, check out DTOs. There's various ways of implementing them. This is just one way of coding it by ourselves. There's things called map struct, and I'll actually share my screen and go to map struct. You can go place mapstruct.org. You can go in here. These are all your dependencies for Maven that you would need to put in there. And just kind of show you little bit of a reference. So they have the car. This isn't necessarily an entity. This is more a POJO, plain old Java object. And this is what they use for the DTO. They'll call classes with getters and setters instead of the record. And then you'll have this mapper interface, and it'll create a mapping implementation. And here's your test. So a lot of this stuff, this map struct will do it automatically for you, at least the mapping implementation. So that could help you quite a bit. So I would say if you really want to get into it and you're kind of confused about things, check out MapStruct. And I will post this in the JPA channel. Okay. Guess we can stop the share for now. Yeah, so that's all I got for this week. I knew that this week was going to be a little bit longer, just because there's so much more coding that we have to put into these DTOs. I expect next week to be kind of long, but I don't think it'll be this long. We will be covering like Spring Security, that sort of stuff. And after that, like we're pretty much done with this. So ain't too much more that I have for you guys. I think that get into some more advanced stuff today and next week. Might do another week where we can just chill and hang out and talk about this sort of stuff. See if you guys have any questions. But yeah, we're almost finished up with this. So if you can follow along up to this point, you're doing amazing. Because like I said, this week a little bit more complicated, quite a bit more complicated than all the entity stuff that we were doing before. So next week it's going to be somewhat similar. I wouldn't say it's going to be as complicated. We're just going to be using a config file, and we're going to be using Spring Security as well. So it's something that I really enjoy doing. And we'll actually put in a password and we will make it convert to a hash from the database. So it's something that's really cool in my opinion. A lot of this stuff today, it's just more, it's interesting, but you know, it's a lot of the same stuff in a way, but you kind of have to think about how you have everything set up and how to map them to a list and how to map them out of the list. So it can be kind of complicated when you have things like sets, right? So sets are really notorious for not having getters, right? And this is kind of why we use them a lot in JPA for the mapping. But you know, there are ways around it. All right. Any more questions, or are we good for the night?
Whew. Got a lot to soak in.
Yeah. I knew tonight was going to be a doozy. So make sure to upload the video, post to the GitHub, and yeah, if you have any questions about this stuff, just reach out to me. And like even tonight, like 99% of the stuff that I wrote tonight worked just fine. And then it was just that one little thing, a couple lines of code that I didn't have in there. And it kind of messed with the update process. So, you know, there's always going to be one little thing. And that's how it is with coding. It can be one semicolon or, you know, a couple lines of code that you need to add. Like I said, the best way to understand this stuff is just go out there and just start coding it. Read the code, then try and replicate it and try and change it a little bit. And that's the best way you're going to learn. Now, you know, that's how I learned. I went through a lot of the tutorials, but you get into this point where you're doing the tutorials all the time, but you're not really truly grasping what's supposed to be done or how you could change things. So the best way I feel like learning is just going in there and trying to do something a little bit differently this time, doing a little bit differently the next time, and just trying to break things and then trying to fix them. And I feel like that's the best way of learning. So today I showed you a few things with the DTOs, and yeah, I had things a little bit broken, but we were able to fix it up in a pretty short amount of time. So, all right, guys. Like I said, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, reach out to me and I'll get back to you guys as soon as possible. And I will see you next week. I hope you guys have a great week. Okay.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you. Have a great night.